So we're gonna do chapter 13 today. We're gonna talk about risk strategies and risk management for enterprise. Um, a lot of the materials has been covered in CIS 27 and 41A, but so we're gonna review some. We're gonna define some new terminology, and then working on a small matrix to look at your loss and your SLE, your ALE, and so on. So we'll talk about those. So at the beginning of the chapter, it goes over how risk is important. I think that this is a big area for cybersecurity professional in general. This is what we do is we actually, our job is to make sure that um, risk can be either mitigated, right? We're going to control and manage the risk um, based on the type of vulnerabilities that we see or the type of threats that we come across in the organization. So it touches on this, and then it talks about how you should be assessing your risk. So for the first question, it says, what is the primary goal of enterprise risk management? I forgot to get captions, so sorry. Let me stop share for a second. Okay, so it asks about the primary goal for enterprise risk management. We want to manage the risk because we want to make sure that we have a long-term goal or a set of goals that we can meet by managing and responding to risk effectively. We know that we are going to have positive and negatively impact risks, or the risks that impact the organization. So we want to make sure that we can either accept, right, reduce the risk, transfer the risk, and so on. So we will talk about different approaches for risk management. Now, when you get into IT management or security management, this is the area that you focus on. Most of this is going to be for like looking at how you can plan out and be able to implement plans so that way you can reduce your risk and be able to meet your mission, right, as a company. So how do we manage our risk? We would break it into two type of approach. One, we can qualify the risk using different tools for assessment. So you would do qualitative risk assessment. This will be an approach where you would assess risk against your assets and the likelihood of the impact in your matrix, which is like a table that you would use. Second, you often see this being done because when we do quantitative risk assessment, we're assessing the value of the assets or the monetary impact of the risk. So let's say that if you have a risk that would cost you $5,000, that's a quantitative way to assess your risk, right? But if you have a risk that would impact the organization at the medium level, that will be a qualitative risk assessment. But we always want to look at the assets, your system, your people, your building, you know, things that the organization would own, facility, land, you know, could be machines. So there are various assets that we would consider in the operations, and we need to make sure that we look at those assets and the impact of the risk. So when you're doing quantitative assessment, you need to start with doing an inventory of the assets and then put down how much that asset is worth, right? Business wise, you would have something like a capital investment for, let's say, manufacturing machine. But then you also need to count the depreciation of that machine over the years, right? So your assets can be considered like servers, your appliances, it could be building, right? So we need to make sure that we create an inventory list of the assets, and then we would quantify based on the dollar amount for those assets, right? People, they are worth money as well, right? Their contribution in the operation is important. So we want to make sure that we measure that. And then data is considered your assets. So data can be, and normally we would see how much that data is cost to build from scratch, right? And to maintain over time. That's going to be a way that you can quantify your data to the dollar. So in this image, right, it goes over how you can assess your risk or your risk management steps. So first you need to identify your business assets. We talked about that. Then we're going to identify the vulnerabilities that's related to these assets. Okay. Often we do this with scan tools to be able to identify system vulnerability, application vulnerabilities. And then we would need to identify the threats, right? This is the weakness, right? This is something that can cause damage, which is the threat. And then we would do a business impact analysis. So we would quantify how that would be in the dollars, how it's going to be quantified to the loss annually based on the occurrences that you see. So we're going to do some of that. And then identify your risk response. How are we going to be able to control it, right? Respond to it, accept, transfer, or mitigate it. So these are the steps. Okay. So when we look at this example, this is a way that we can qualify your risk assessment. The likelihood of a data breach, right? Let's say it's on a scale of 10, this company is going to be 6. The impact level is going to be 9. And so when you multiply these things together, you get a 54 for your risk score. Okay. Then your ransomware, the likelihood is going to be 8. So how do they come up with this likelihood is based on historical data or data for a similar organization, right? Industry data that could be also useful. And then the impact level is 9. So when you multiply 8 times 9, you get a 72. And then if you're looking at database corruption, that is low, right? Likelihood is 2. And your impact is 5. And then you multiply that, that's going to be 10. So the one with the higher risk score, that's going to be the one that you're going to address first. That's high priority. So you need to prioritize your response based on that. Okay. Now, when you have it ranking like this in the level, for me, I normally like to give my range some kind of numerical value, right, for the low. So, for example, if you have the CIA, you would do the admin information. This is low. So let's say your low score is going to be 1 to 4 or 1 to 3. And then 4 to 6 is going to be medium, or 4 to 7 is going to be medium. 8 to 10 is going to be high. So with that, if you want to come back and compute it out, calculate it out, it's going to be a lot easier for you to kind of see, right, the differences between something that's 54 and 72. Okay. But here, what they did is they have a matrix that is, you have to put down the impact in confidentiality, integrity, and availability for your systems and your data. So for your admin information, that's low across CIA. Your data here is medium, but the integrity is high. So depending on the type of data that you work with. So if you're looking at like health information for your patients, right? Integrity has to be high, right? Availability has to be high, right? And then confidentiality also has to be high for us to fulfill HIPAA compliance, right? So that's priority. But if you're looking at other systems and other data that might not be essential, then you would be ranking accordingly. Okay, so it varies from organization to organization. You're looking at organization type and the type of data within and the system within. Okay. Okay, and here's your quantitative risk assessment. So we need to have the assets value, which is known as your AV. And this could be the price that you bought the machine or the system or the computer or, you know, the equipment for, and or your investment, right? So we would look at the asset value. Then important that we need to identify the exposure factor. So it tells you here that it is rare that you would have a total loss that is 100%. You do see some severe cases, right? We have a catastrophe where things get wiped out. Like, let's say that you would see something like the storm that came through Florida or earthquake in different part of the world where it wipes that whole region out, then you have 100% loss. If we are the only, if that's only our location. So if you're looking at the example, it says if the building is flooded, the cost to repair the damage would not be equal to the entire building unless that building is completely, you know, to gravel, right? Nothing is left. So it's rare that you have 100% loss. And then you have a single loss expectancy. So you're going to take the assets value and you're going to multiply it by the exposure factor. Then from there, you'll be able to calculate the annualized loss expectancy, your AL. So this could be if you have multiple incidents of the same type or the same threat in the year. So let's say if we have malware incidents that cause some loss, so you would have multiple occurrences, and you would take that value and then multiply it by your SLE to be able to get your annual loss expectancy. And everything is going to quantify to the dollar. So if we're looking at this example, and it's important we look at this because we're going to do an exercise on something similar. So in this case, you have a plant, right? And it is a production plant, and the worth of the plant is worth $10 million. Using historical data, they're looking at climates and things like flood in the area. So for California, flood is going to be very low. But when you look at that in Florida or in another state, that's going to be highly impacted. So you have to use some kind of, you have to research, right, the statistic information for that. So it says the data calculates those floods that will be twice in 100 years, right? So we're looking at that's very low. So your annual occurrence rate is going to be 2%, okay? Because based on the data, that's going to be 0.02 or, I'm sorry. Yeah, it's going to be 2% for the annual because it's going to occur twice in 100 years. So you're going to take 2 divided by 100, you get 2%, right? Does that make sense? So the data, this is what it's shown. Two times that it happens in 100 years. So you take the number and you divide it by the 100 years here. Then you have the damage that result in $2 million. And $2 million, if you come back and you take this number, how did they come up with this? Or the percentage is $2 million is the damage. That's going to be a fraction of the $10 million. So you take 2 million divided by 10 million, that's 1/5, which is 20%. Okay. So once you have that value, you're gonna take that $2 million and you're gonna multiply it by your ARO, which is your 2% from the ones that you calculate here. And that's gonna give you $40,000, which is your ALE. Okay. So you start out with looking at how often that happens, right? That's gonna give you the percentage, and then you're gonna look at the exposure factor. And then from there, you'll be able to identify or calculate your SLE and your ALE. Okay, so let's define some terms on the assignment, and then we'll do an exercise. So for number 3, it says, what metric is calculated by multiplying assets value and exposure factor? That's going to be your SLE. Your SLE, you're going to take your asset value when you're quantifying your risk, and you're going to multiply it by your EF. So when you're taking certification like this one, your CASP or your CYSA, they expect you to know how to calculate these. So make sure that you remember. AV times EF is SLE. Assets value times exposure factor equals single loss expectancy. And we would be able to also calculate your ALE. So your annualized loss expectancy is the total expected loss per year from a specific risk. So let's say that if we have 2 employees losing their laptops a year, right? That's 2 occurrences that we have in a year. And each of the laptop costs $2,000. So you would take each of the loss, each of your SLE, which is $2,000, and you multiply it by 2. So in a year, our annualized loss expectancy for your mobile devices is going to be $4,000, right? 2 times 2,000, your ARO times your SLE is going to be your ALE. So 4,000 a year that we would lose for the laptop. Now, in risk management, we also need to look at gap analysis. This is a way for us to look at missing control by comparing the current state to the desired state of security. As a consultant, you would see that this is the area that you work in, because you don't get hired if there's no gap, right? Sometimes you would be brought on because there's a gap to meet compliance, but there's also with incident occurs within the gap. So when you have a gap in security is where you would have deficiency in your security state, which means that you don't have the appropriate control or you have missing control. So when you're doing gap analysis, you look at vulnerabilities in the system, which cause gaps, right? You would look at applications weaknesses, the flaws in design of the network. So in security, when we're looking at the gaps, that's going to give, and we would compare how we're doing, right? And you can quantify that to get some kind of risk score and to your desired state, where you want to be, right? And this needs to be done regularly to be proactive. Otherwise, you will run into security problems. The companies that don't do gap analysis and have improvement in security and their plans for security is going to suffer eventually down the line, because the gap is where that's going to be where the problem occurs. Okay. That sounds very salesy, right? That sounds like a sales pitch, but it's true. So we want to make sure that we do gap analysis. And gap analysis, you can find this on page 4. So it says that you must be able to assess the current state and compare it to your desired state. So how do I do that? First, I need to look at what I currently have in place, my security measures, and where I want to be, my goal for security, right? And we want to look at long-term and short-term for this. And then from there, we're going to say, okay, we currently have this. We're lacking some areas. Let's say that we don't have appropriate remote access security for our employee. We probably have a lot of local area network security. So what will happen is we would need to make sure that we would identify the solution to bridge the gap. So we need to take a look at maybe implement virtual private network that is secure, like VPN with IPsec. So you would dive a little deeper into the solutions that's going to get you to where you want to be. And then find ways to implement those solutions. So it's going to take you multiple steps to meet or to close out that gap, right? And then it touches on some of the term that sounds very business-like, right? Total cost of ownership. So if we're buying a system or a device, that system would require licensing for access, right? For software, additional staff to maintain that system. So the cost is not just right out buying the server from the vendor, but also additional costs that would go into that system in order for it to operate. So you have to calculate this, and it's going to be for the lifetime of that system. So on average, we would say that that server is going to last us 7 years, and the total cost of it. So the total cost of ownership is different than the purchasing price. Okay. And then your return on investment, you need to also include this into a matrix. This is going to see how you are going to be able to get what you're going to get out of your money. So what you need to do is your formula is going to be, your ROI is going to be reduction in risk, subtract cost of control, and that's how you're going to quantify your ROI. Okay. So the example, they have that here. They invested $10,000, right? And then for the control, if it's 90% effective, so that way the users is more aware, or there are ways that we can prevent attack. So you take $90,000, subtract $10,000. Why is it $90,000? It's 90% times 10,000. So that's 90,000. Subtract the 10, you get 80% for your return on it. I mean, $80,000 for your return on investment. Okay, so let's answer the next question and then do exercise 8. So the next part of the notes, it talks about the mean time to recover your MTTR measure. And you have to be able to recover your system less than the expected downtime, right? So this is part of your security plan. So the mean time to recover measures the average time taken to recover in the case of failure. So let's say that if your system crash, how long does it take for it to be back online again, right? And it could be varied from problem to problem. So let's say that if I have a server crash due to hardware failure, I can quickly replace that hardware and be able to bring it back online. But also getting the hardware to the system. So let's say that it's going to take us 24 hours to be able to buy the hardware and then be able to replace it. For example, like RAM or storage, right? But if we have the hardware on hand, our downtime will be less. That will be 4 hours. So your mean time to recover, we are going to look at the downtime, looking at the average downtime, and your mean time to recover is going to be less than the average failure time, okay, or your mean time for failure. So we want to make sure that we can bring it up online. So some systems, some issue would take an hour, some issue would take 24 hours for the same system, right? So we would need to be able to identify that, and we would go use that mean time as part of the baseline where we operate. Okay. So we have maybe perhaps if it's down too long, then we can implement solutions we have a failover server that's going to take its place when it goes down, right? But then we have to look at the return on investment for that failover server, because if our mean time to recover is very low, right, likely that we might not need the failover server. And also if the return on investment is too high, then we have to probably consider other options. Okay. Sometimes the company would just eat the risk, right? You accept it. You say, okay, well, I'm going to be out for 24 hours. I might lose $1,000 for my business. Not a big deal, right? But sometimes that can be $1 million, and then that $1 million, you know, so it's probably worth it to have some kind of backup solutions and recovery solutions. Okay, for 8. ABC Corporation is a manufacturer in Los Angeles. This year, the company has faced one fire that caused some damage in one of the 4 buildings. Each building, including internal asset, is worth $5 million. Data shows that the local area fire occurs once every 10 years. Additionally, a property vandalism incident occurred following the fire. So they have a second incident, a second threat, which caused a loss of $10,000. In the surrounding area, data shows that 1 of 100 businesses is impacted in vandalism each year. Use the below table to determine the EF, the ARO, which is annual rate of occurrence, the annual loss expectancy, ALE, for each threat, and the total loss, which is your annualized loss expectancy. So the equation that you're given here is your SLE is going to be your assets value times your exposure factor. Your ALE is your SLE times ARO. So at the top, you need to put down the total worth of your assets for the organization. That's $20 million. Why? Because you got 4 buildings and each building costs $5 million, including all the internal assets, people, data, systems, machines, equipment, everything for the company, right? 4 buildings, each building costs $5 million. So that's going to be 5 million times 4. Then next we are going to state the threats that's shown in this case. So first, I think you already include that there for you, is the fire. So the fire, if you read, I'm going to bring this down, sorry, so I can see it all on one page. The fire, it tells you that it impacted 1 out of the 4 buildings. And there's only about 1 fire that occurs every 10 years. Okay. So your exposure factor, we're only exposed to the incident in 1 out of our 4 building, which is 25%. Right? So your SLE here, and the way that we calculate our SLE is going to be equal to your assets value, which is $5 million, We're gonna multiply it by the exposure factor, which is 25%. That gives us 1.25 million. Then you have your annual rate of occurrence, your ARO, and in the case, it tells you that there's a fire happening once every 10 years, right? So that means that we're gonna take 1 divided by 10 times 100. So it's going to be 1/10 of a percent per year, right? Because it's 1 every 10 years. So that's gonna give you so you can take the calculator, you can divide it. Let me double check. It doesn't sound. Yeah. And then you times it by 100, that's gonna give you 10%. Yeah, 10%, one every 10 years. And then, so once you have that, you're going to calculate the AL and ALE, annualized loss expectancy, which is your total loss. You're gonna take the SLE, which is, we got the 1.25 million. And you're gonna multiply it by your ARO, which is your 10%. That gives you $125,000. So each year we should expect there might be some damage by fire by $125,000 for ABC. Right? Which is a very small fraction from what you see with the total assets there, but $125,000 can be a lot of money. When we're looking at, like, you have to look at revenue, the income of the company, the costs for operation, and all of the other things. So the business aspect. So for $125,000 now, we have to consider solution, right? As far as suppression, system, fire alarm, and fire retardant type of material for the facility, whatever it is. And internally, it could be fire that caused internally. So we have to take a look at the cost of the fire for this incident. If it is external, like if it's just wildfire that's catching onto the building, that is probably more on a smaller percentage. But internally, if our machines is causing fire or products that we use that's cause fire, then for $125,000, we should consider other products, right? So the risk managers, that this is what, they look at how that quantify and how that can be reduced or accepted. Okay, so for the vandalism incidents happen following the fire. So we see here that there's a loss of $10,000. Okay. And then we want to be able to calculate that out. So first, we look at the exposure factor. So we would see that the data shows that there is one of 100 businesses that's impacted per year. So your occurrences is going to be 1%. So 1 divided by 100 times 100%. That's going to give you that 1%. So we got that information from the data here. Our event the SLE that's given here is that incident cost us $10,000 or cost ABC Corp $10,000, right? And then if you take, hold on one second, let me check my numbers. $10,000 divided by, what was it? 5 million, right? Yeah, if you take the $10,000, which is cost by the vandalism, and you divide it by your total value, your building assets, because it's only impacted one building. So that's gonna give you 2% for exposure factor. So we would multiply that by 100% to get you the percentage here. So it's minimal. And then after that, we would calculate the AL. So we already have the exposure factor, right? I don't think we truly need this, but if you look at the equation, your SLE is your exposure factor times your assets. So the $10,000, if we have this value, it should be the 0.02% times the 5 million, which is going to give you $10,000. Then we have the ARO, which is given to us by the data here. So each year, 1 out of 100 businesses in that area is impacted. So that's your 1%. So your ALE is going to be, I'll retype this, is going to be equal to your SLE, which is $10,000. Oops. Times it by your ARO, which is 1%. And so if you plug this into your calculator, if we have $10,000, we times it by 0.01 is going to be $100, which is very small. So each year we should expect about $100 in loss for vandalism, and that could be like, you know, people throw rocks at the window or something like that. But $10,000 is probably more damage than that. Like they might have destroyed something externally to the building, or whatnot, right? So $400 each year that we should expect. And so even if our single incident costs $10,000, right, throughout the years, we should have a plan for at least $100 will be lost for vandalism based on the statistic. Drastically huge in difference. So this incident right here would be an outlier if you're looking at this number. Okay. Because on average, we would see that, oh, you know, $100 would be lost for vandalism, but we had an incident that's cost us $10,000. So it is an outlier. It's drastically higher than what we calculate out for the year, right? So there's a gap, you see? So what can I do? Well, for the $10,000 loss in comparison to the expected $100, what we would see is we would probably think about implementing fencing, right, perimeter, security guards, et cetera, et cetera. But we have to take a look at the return on investment for fencing and security guard, right? So physical security is also an area that we overlook. And so you would continue to go down and build out your table for threats, right? Insider threats, external threats, system threats, etc. So the next part, it goes over your risk techniques, right? We can either transfer, accept, avoid, or mitigate. And transfer is another way that we can control our risk. For example, a quick example for this is if we buy cybersecurity insurance, uh, we would then transfer the risk to insurance company in the case that we come across threat and it impacted us, right? We can accept the risk. We can say, you know what, it's not worth the implementation of the solution because it costs too much money and we have to tear down most of our network. So we would just accept the risk or avoid the risk. So we would not pursue a certain activity or solution. So let's say that if the company wants to have a web app and when they look at the risk for the web app, the cost in maintaining it and there might be security issues for it. So we just, to avoid it, we're not going to implement the web app, right? And then, or we can mitigate it, we can reduce to an acceptable level where we would implement some solution that's going to help reduce that. Like I said earlier, right? Fencing around the building doesn't completely remove vandalism, but it reduces vandalism. If you put security guard, it is a way of deterrence. So it would deter some people from vandalizing the building. So you do have some mitigation in that to an acceptable level. And then for question 9, it goes over the difference between inherent and residual risk. Your inherent risk exists before the controls are applied. Inherent risk is a set of risks that's been there, right? It's something that is maybe, if you're looking at like, I think the example that the book gives is actually a good example. Like financial institution employs staff with no background check. That's an inherent risk because you don't know that if they are going to commit fraud, right? So if you install an application of a company that filed bankrupt and they will not be able to maintain and provide you with updates, that causes an inherent risk. And that happens to many organizations, right? You buy an application, a software, and then the company went and sold, and then they stopped producing that software, but you continue to use it. What happens is when you continue to use it, it causes an inherent risk because no developer will then continue to update it. Now you have to go back to your internal team and you're going to say how we're going to probably have to write the updates for the software, right? But we might not be capable of doing that because if you don't know maybe you don't have access or you don't own, right, the module for the software, you cannot be able to modify the software because of the licensing. So at that point, it would make more sense to get rid of the inherent risk and upgrade it to a different software. Like you would not use that software anymore. So when we say upgrade, right, we just scrap the software. So we have to transition that out. Okay. And then residual risk is risk that remains after the control. So if you're looking at the solution from earlier, background check, right? For banks, they might do background check on the employee, but it doesn't necessarily remove the complete risk, right? Even with background check, people can still commit fraud, or other things that will cause them to commit certain type of crime. So what you would, excuse me, what you would see is you do have some residual risk. Okay. And then earlier we saw in the picture, and we saw the section on the forming risk response and strategy, transfer, accept, avoid, or mitigate. We talked about that. So the business strategies in this is, let's say that you own a company and you're at risk with your competitor. So for example, I own a company and my competitor can take me out of my business, right? Because they are a competitor and they are taking my clientele. So how can I reduce that risk, right? I can accept the risk and keep losing money in my business, or we can do what most capitalist country type of organization do, right? What do? We buy them out. So a way to get rid of your competitive risk is to get rid of them. And this is what you see with social media companies like TikTok. Because now you see the American social media companies saying, oh, most of my users are now transitioning to this other platform. But you see that with everything that you actually, the products that you use, right? You got a bread company that owns like 5 different brands because they eventually just start acquiring, so that way they don't have to deal with the competitiveness in the business, in the risk. So a lot of the IT and the cybersecurity functionality plays into operation, and operation is business, and everything comes back to the dollar. Every solution that we implement, everything from user training all the way to like the application that we use, all of that is really equate out to profit, right? Okay. So this is why you see university offer MBAs instead of, they have Master of Science, which I acquired, but you can have a focus in management. You can also have, so a lot of it is management strategies. And then there's a section on exceptions. So sometime when they cannot comply to laws and regulations or corporate policy, in circumstances, you do have risk exceptions. Okay, where it would be signed off by stakeholders, investors, people that participate in the company. So remember that we identify, assess. This is where you use your matrix, right? And then prioritize. Then you're going to do control. And then we review and we start all over again. Okay. Because our threat landscape in security changes all the time. Like you can see malware change, technology change. So your risk change as well. So if you implement a solution 3 years ago, right, and if you haven't reviewed it annually, you would have a higher gap. Okay. So it talks about some frameworks. So where do I go to reference some information if I haven't done this before? NIST is going to be your go-to for this area, right? National Institute of Science and Technology. They have documentation that's published to help you do risk management. You can also use like Department of Defense framework, your RMF. This would work well with organization that comply to FISMA, public sector type of organization, but if you operate for private sector, later on we're going to touch on ISO. So you can refer to this, that this is going to give you good guidance on how to be able to kind of build out your risk management plan. Okay. So this picture is important. I think it gives you the appropriate documentation for the section of your framework. Like you would always continue to monitor, right? That's gonna see if your security control is effective. And then when we're doing assets identification, you want to categorize your system and data. That is very important, right? We talked about data classification, but when you categorize your systems, and then that's going to give you a better understanding of your priorities and then also the type of data that's associated with those systems. Okay. So this gives you an overall picture and then the associated documentation for NIST. I think similarly, when you look at the framework compare from DoD to NIST framework, it's going to be closely related. So you have identify, protect, that's where your control is going to be, right? Detect. So you want to be proactive versus reactive, right? You would still have to continue to monitor. Monitor is detection, and then respond, and then recover. So the 5 stages. Okay, let's go through and answer additional questions. So in the next section, it's going to talk about key risk indicator, your KRIs. This is going to help you measure events or activity that can introduce risk. So for example, like activities like people writing down their passwords, that will introduce risk. Or people opening doors for other people, that's just a lack of user training or, employee training. And KRIs is a set of indicators that's going to help you look at potentially what would be your risk, okay? And it serves as warning or threshold to be crossed. So you want to measure these activities and then look at ways to be able to reduce it before it happens. So that way you don't have more of a higher severity level of risk. And in the acceptance, we can accept certain level of risk. So if a company have high risk appetite, that means that they can accept high risk, or they're willing to accept high risk. A lot of the times, this type of company, they already assess the return on investment for the risk solution, right? So what you would see is that you would accept the risk. So for example, if you have a social media company and they're not being compliant, right? They went to Supreme Court and they're fine with a lot of money. But before that, they already know. So for example, like data leakage or insufficient data protection for their user. So ongoing 10 years, they probably assess the risk for that, implement additional measure to protect user data, or sell the data and make money, right? So if they turn around and sell the data, let's say that they make $30 million. But when in the case that it goes to court, when they assess this, they said, in the case that we go to court, we might get fined $5 million or $10 million. It's only a fraction of what we could gain. So this is what you see is that people would sell the data or not implement a proper measure, right? A lot of times it's sell the data. even and not notify the user, let's say, and that happened in the past, accept the risk, and they would have high risk appetite because they already profit from the sales of the data. And this is what you see a lot now. Okay. So, and then after with that, you would see sometimes they would get fined, and then they would just fire whoever that was supposed to be in charge of that, right? Took a loss for that company. That person would probably bounce back and get another job with another tech company. Even in the case that, you know, they are famous for certain loss or whatever. This industry, when you at that level, sometimes you have connection, you'll be able to get work. But risk appetite can also be low. So if you're not able to take a lot of loss, especially monetary loss, you probably have to find ways to reduce the risk, because everything comes down to the dollars. But to reduce risk, you have to invest. So you have to spend some money to make sure that your money is not, you don't have additional loss to your money. That's usually the case. Okay. And then the next part of this, it talks about people, and human is a factor that we cannot do away, even though there's a lot of talk about AI and how AI can, you know, can help in reducing some of the deficiency in this area. Yes, there, you know, the computer is always going to be functioning as it should, unless it get attacked or hacked, right? Circumvented, etc. So we want to make sure that our staff, right, is, or the users and people are going to be doing what they're supposed to do. So you have to implement areas for people like user awareness training, right? Occasional assessment in how they are, and also background check, and all of those things are important. So the processes for the human side is required. And then in the process, you don't want to have anything that's a single point failure, including the people. So if you have a manager that does everything, if that manager quits or commit fraud, you cannot detect it. It's difficult. Okay. Same thing with computer, right? If you have a single point failure, when that system goes down, you're gonna have a severe disruption. So when we look at this, right, how we implement technology solutions, we always want to look at the risk aspect of technology, people, or processes, okay, for our operation. So this shows you a little bit about how you can track risk. So you would have something similar to this. You would put down your risk register, right? You would have a numerical value that's assigned, and then the divisions or the department, and then the activity that's associated and the risk, and then the control rating and risk level. So you should document this. I know that to fulfill compliance, if you don't have this, you won't pass compliance. So this is important. This is part of auditing as well. So you would document your risk register like this. Okay. And then your KPI, your key performance indicator, that will be your business value for the important activities. So for example, if I'm a retailer, my primary activity is what? Selling products online, right? But within that, I have processes, right? Like transactions, inventory, stuff like that. Okay. And then, so you would look at your key performance indicator, that will be a number or a value that is associated with your activities for security posture. So if I'm looking at an online company, an online retailer, the key performance indicator would measure, right, my security maybe solutions or protections for my DMZ systems, or even internal networks like local area networks, and how my customer is making their purchases, accessing their accounts, processing refunds, all of those things, right? That on the daily basis. We talked about risk indicator, risk appetite. Okay, so for 13, it says, how does separation of duties help mitigate risk? How does that help mitigate risk? So this is important. I think you probably learned this also in other classes. If you have one person that's having too much control, or if they're accessing everything, like a manager that's functioning multiple roles in the company, you would likely, if you lose that person, or if that person commit fraud, it's harder to detect. So if they have too much control, it's more difficult to reduce the risk in the case of fraudulent or error. So that means that we want to be able to assign other people to have that same function or role, to be able to overlook, because when you do that, you would likely catch the error, right? People sometimes take shortcuts to, streamline their work. So that means that, they might have some kind of error or can make mistake. So if you assign other people that's overlooking that or doing the same thing, you would have separation of duties. And then for 14, the benefits of mandatory vacation policy, when you force people to take vacation, right? Someone who steps in during the vacation, they will be able to identify mistakes if the mistakes happen. So it helps audit employee activities and, or illegal actions. It deters illegal actions. So now companies would usually implement this. You have to take your vacation by the end of the year or you would lose it. That's funny. It's not for your mental health or for you to be okay. It's just simply so we can touch you. Right. We don't care about you. Well, people should do that for mental health. And well, I think for this college district, you can keep your sick and vacation time until you leave, right? So as a faculty, I'm contracted a little bit different, not like a regular staff. So yeah, I think regular staff have a different policy, but because we're not contracted in a whole 12 months, we do an academic year, so it's a 10-month span. And then for the summer and the winter, that's not counted as part of our work time. So it is a little bit different. We don't have vacation time like staff. We just have, work time and sick leave. So we earn sick leave as we go along. And then when we leave, if those hours are not used, we can cash them in. I had worked for a couple private sector company. Yeah, they did enforce the required vacation policy. They want you to take at least 2 weeks during the first 6 months and then another 2 weeks during the second 6 months. But for sick leave, they did not require that. So I knew someone who had worked for the company for 30 something years. And when he left, he had a lot of sick time. So he just took months of vacation or off time, right? Sick time. You see a lot of that too. Especially at the end of, they're gonna retire. Yeah, just take the last few months off. That'd be nice. That's what I intend to do. Yeah, some company, they require your sick time to be documented. So yeah, like the prior company I had worked for, you have to provide documentation in order to take sick time. Unless you just have a flu, that's a day, but if you take longer than a week, you have to provide documentation. So a doctor's note is required. Okay. We just have a few more to go, and then we'll do our lab, and then we'll be on our way. Sorry. Here it talks about trade-off analysis, right? You're looking at risks for organization, and there might be many risks that respond to the strategy evaluated, it says. So in security, we always want to think about defense in depth. When you implement solution, it should overlap. There are many things that you need to do to have your effective security solution. Okay. So to mitigate risk, you would use multiple approaches, applying policies, right? Implementing practices, having more awareness, having system control. There are a lot of different things that we would need to employ. And then your SOD. Job rotation is also important. I think some company, they can do this, and other companies you can't, right? You know, I don't think that we can do job rotation as faculty unless you hire a team of faculty that have, multiple credentials that will be able to teach in different area where they would be cross-discipline. That would work, right? So it depends on the organization. It might not always be effective for all organization. And then least privilege. So let's go to. So service level agreement, we know that SLA stand for service level agreement. This is important for cloud and also third-party organization or contracted organization. This is just a document that legally bind the performance that is expected of the company. So if I have an SLA with a cloud company like the AWS, right? I would have some level of agreement established, written down for that organization. Or that could also be service. Okay. So your SLA is just a contract that states expectations and performance, or expectation of the performance or services delivery from that particular vendor. I highly recommend have this review by the legal team, so that way you don't come across unexpected risk down the line. And then for 16, it says, what is vendor lock-in and why is it a risk? So vendor lock-in occurs when your client is depending on the vendor service, making it costly or difficult to switch to providers, which can lead to inferior service or high cost. You see this with in some cases, utility companies, and the local businesses. So for example, right, if there's a utility company that only service that particular region, you're required to use it and you don't have any other options, they can raise the price as much as they want and you have to pay for it. You see this with communication company as well, right? And so if they are the only one that produce the product that you're using, you don't have a choice, but you have to buy their product, right? So it is sometimes a very niche. And in that case, you cannot go without having acquired the product or the service. And then your risk register, you saw an example of the table for the risk register. This, we list the risks, so we document the risks, the actions that will be taken, the impact of the risk in the business operation. And that will allow us to monitor the type of risk that we have. And then for 18, how does network segmentation support risk management? I think we touched on this the first week and then throughout this semester, and it's going to come back to this. It's important for us because network defense is always, an approach in network defense is always a good thing. That's going to elevate a little bit more security for your network. So if you isolate your sensitive system, that's a form of network segmentation. This is going to reduce the level of exposure for threat through the network. So it's going to reduce the risk because you would then face less threat in that part of the network for your sensitive data. And then you would have a lower impact on data loss or leakage with the appropriate measure, of course. And then the first part, the first phase of NIST cybersecurity framework, identify. This is first we'll start with recognizing assets. So when you're dealing with risk management, the first step, right, like I said, is to identify your assets. It's the same thing. Identify phase includes recognizing your assets and their vulnerabilities, because the vulnerabilities will result in risk. Okay, so we looked at the frameworks. And then it talks about employee procedures, non-disclosure agreement. You see a lot of this in our field. This is a common thing, right? That means that whatever that happens for the business operations, you cannot disclose that to other people, competitors, sometimes family members or relatives, or, outside of the company. Especially when you deal with public sector that have high clearance for sensitive data access. Okay, so we must train, right? And have awareness for the user. That's going to help, like phishing campaign. Some of you worked on those. Password practices. All the social engineering tactics. We want to make sure that they're aware of those things. And that's ever changing now that we have AI, right? We have deep fake and other things. Okay. So auditing is a very big area. I highly recommend you go for auditing certification. You can look at ISACA, right? And see the type of like IT auditing or system auditing type of certification that can also help you along with this certification. Okay, vendor login information is here. We talked about cloud service and service level agreement. And then you have vendor lockout. So when you choose a service provider, right, make sure that you look at how that will play into risk management and then your business continuity plan in the long run. And then it touches on merger and acquisition risk. You see company merging all the time, right? You have to assess the risk when you are combining the systems and the network and you are now overlapping, the companies that are being merged, okay? Or your sister company. So that means that we have apply, change management, and all the processes within to be able to provide support. Okay. And then it touches on some areas about the vendors, using assessment tool. They have FedRAMP, Federal Risk Authorization Management information. Then your cloud control matrix. This is useful when you're dealing with security for cloud. I think a lot of companies are on cloud, right? So using cloud technology. So we want to make sure that we have appropriate compliance base of matrix that's used. So you can click on the link to visit it if you're curious. Now, international organization of standardization, you see a lot of this. If you go to conference or if you hear, cybersecurity talk, they always look at ISO. So standards, right, are not guidelines. Okay. So we have to meet standards where guidelines we don't have to employ. We don't, it's just a recommendation that you can or cannot, you don't have to, right? So the ISO that you often see is the 27,000 and the version is the 2018. So this is the standard that would be required or covering security control for your systems. Like how we want to have protection of information, right? For our customer, our partners, our employees, and our financial systems. So you see some of the solutions online for security that would be related to this. And then the 27001 version 2013, right? It focused on CIA for the system. So these standards covers the security control, right? Our operational area. So for 20, it says, what is ISO IEC 27001 standard designed for? It is your InfoSec standard that is used to ensure confidentiality, integrity, availability of your information systems. CIA. And then for 21, why is continuous monitoring crucial in risk management? Because it ensures compliance with regulatory requirements and it helps detect deviation from security baselines for timely mitigation. So a lot of it is to fulfill compliance. And it makes sure that you stay aligned with the practices for compliance. Okay. And reducing the risk in an appropriate timeline manner. Question. I think we only have 21 today. Yep. So make sure you go through the notes, look at the information. You will be expected to have some risk management information in your security plan for your project. Okay, so I will go over that next time when we meet. And then that will give you a couple of weeks to work on it, so that should be feasible. This is one of my topic for my comprehensive exam. They give you a list of topic to choose on which area that you know best and what you can answer. I had to pick 3. And this is one of the areas. Risk management. Okay, I'll stop the video lecture and then we'll work on the lab.